We'll get started.
Friend's house he lives down there.
This is Adam Soule. He's from Soule. He did his PhD at the University of Oregon, and he works on the water volcanoes. So it's pretty exciting stuff. Over.
Well, thank you for having me here. When Ashley got in touch with me, she said she would like me to talk about some intersection between the work I do in seafloor mapping and magmatic and volcanic systems, and so I'm going to focus today on dynamics of submarine eruptions. And this is a kind of pretty picture, but the fact of the matter is that we know very little about the dynamics of eruptions in the deep sea, mostly because it's very difficult to be on the deep sea, and to be there when there's an eruption is even harder. But the fact is that the mid-ocean ridge system, which is what I'll focus on mostly today, is by far the Earth's most voluminous magmatic system. About 70% or more of the Earth's annual volcanic budget comes out of mid-ocean ridges. And we know very little about the physical characteristics of these eruptions, their size, volume, how frequently they occur, and the dynamics of the eruptions. Most of our information comes from kind of regional scale bathymetric mapping. I'm showing two examples here, one from the fast spreading East Pacific Rise, one from the slow spreading Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And there are clear differences between systems of different spreading rates. The East Pacific Rise is very well relieved and is kind of smooth. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is much rougher. And that's in part due to the dynamics of the eruptions. So I'm going to explore a little bit about what we understand about them and how I'm attempting to quantify them. But I'll start off trying to justify why we should even care. Why someone might say, the oceanic crust is 7 kilometers thick. What do I care about the upper couple hundred meters of it? It's this very thin cap of extrusive lavas at the top of this system. But I would argue that this small cap is really the only archive or the best archive we have for all the geochemical and petrogenetic processes that are happening in the mantle and through the crust. And also the physical properties of this cap modulate fluid pathways and impact the chemical and thermal exchange between heat sources in the crust and the mantle and the oceans above. So this is kind of just by the fact that it's at this interface becomes a rather important way. And the physical properties of it relate to how the eruptions occur. So we have this very simple view of the oceanic crust and this hyper complex view of the upper oceanic crust. If anyone knows Dan Fernari, that explains why it's hyper complex. But the key physical characteristic of this upper oceanic crust is its low permeability. So in this compilation of data from ocean drilling, you can see that the upper few hundred meters of crust have several orders of magnitude higher permeability than the deeper crust. So one of the impacts of that is significant heat flow deficit between what we would predict in the solid line for heat flow and what we observed. And that's due to the fact that there's hydrothermal circulation going on in the crust, and in particular in this upper oceanic crust made up of lava flows. Andy Fisher and his colleagues have demonstrated this nicely, not just at the ridge axis, but in older oceanic crust where they see water influx at outcrops of basalt on the seafloor, large tracts of seafloor covered by sediments, and water flowing out at other outcrops. And they call this the kind of layer 2A, or the extrusive volcanic superhighway. So there's a lot of fluid flow causing heat or thermal exchange, and this is also an important environment for biology, for microbial communities. Sorry, I'm a little bit viral, so I'm gonna need to drink some water every now and again. So, in the past, our understanding of eruption dynamics has come from the morphology of the lava flows that are in place on the seafloor. And this goes all the way back to shortly after ridges were identified. Bob Ballard did a lot of this work in the 70s. And there are kind of three classes of lava flows on the ocean floor. Pillows, which people are often familiar with, kind of commonly cited as the dominant geologic landform on the Earth's surface, if you count the seafloor. Low bait lava flows, which are like pillows but kind of flatter and wider, and then sheet lava flows, which don't really have much structure to them. These are thought to reflect a spectrum of increasing volume flux, so that the faster the lava flows, the less effective the cooling and quenching of that surface is at stopping it. So sheet flows are flowing fast, and they produce relatively low relief landforms, whereas pillow flows are moving slowly, building little bulbs of lava and ultimately constructing mounds and ridges and such. This has been parameterized, if you will, by Tracy Gregg and John Fink and Ross Griffiths using analog materials to simulate lava flows. So they take polyethylene glycol wax. This is a very common wax. It's probably in a lot of the foods that you eat and in lotions and all sorts of things. It has the nice property that it's liquid at room temperature, but freezes at slightly below room temperature. So they would inject this wax into cold water, and it would form a crust, and that was supposed to represent lava and the solidified, or molten lava and solidified lava. And based on that, they've come up with a parameter psi, which is the time scale of cooling to the time scale of convection. So on the time scale of cooling is going to be similar in most deep ocean settings. It's the time scale of advection that matters, and for sheet flows, advection is fast, and for pillows, advection is slow. There's numbers on this plot in terms of viscosity and flow rate, but you can't really be trusted. The physical properties of the wax don't scale very well to actual lava, but the relative values are I think, useful framework for interpreting dynamics of eruptions just by looking at flow morphology. So, early on in the kind of study of mid-ocean ridges and volcanic products, Bonatti and Harrison made this observation that when you look at the relative proportion of sheet flows, so these are the high flow rate lava flows, and pillow flows, the low rate flow rate lava flows, as a function of spreading rate, you see a nice correlation that at very slow spreading rates, you have mostly pillows erupted, and at very fast spreading rates, you have mostly sheet flows erupted. Since this compilation came out, it's been added to several studies that I've taken part in, and this relationship holds up pretty well. So this is a really kind of powerful figure in my mind, because it suggests that there's a fundamental difference between ridges of different spreading rates that is manifested in the dynamics of the eruptions. What the model is that controls that, is something to be debated, but by trying to quantify the dynamics, I think we're going to be able to get to kind of first order properties of how these magmatic systems work. So I'm going to give you a few examples of the models that people have suggested for why there is this relationship between spreading rate and flow morphology or flow dynamics. In the original compilation by Bonatti and Harrison, they suggested that thermal variations produce differences in the viscosity of the lava that then result in differences in the morphology. So the idea, and you can tell this is a relatively old figure because they have this ginormous magma reservoir within the crust. We now know the magma reservoir is much more localized. But the idea here is that, so this is supposed to represent a mid-ocean ridge segment where you have a short path through the crust, you produce sheet flows because you haven't cooled the lava that much, and where you have a longer path, you produce more pillow flows. The problem with this, when you look at the kind of global system, is that the composition of the magmas, in terms of magnesium, which can give you the liquidus temperature, shows the opposite trend, that at slower spreading rates, you have higher temperature magmas being erupted than at faster spreading rates. So that model isn't necessarily appropriate. Another model that was suggested by Mike Perfit and Bill Chadwick is that there's a difference in magmatic overpressure due to differences in tectonic stress variation. So those first two bathymetric maps I showed you, the slow spreading ridge had lots of big faults, the fast spreading ridge didn't. The assumption is that at a slow spreading ridge, you have lower magma supply, so more of the spreading is accommodated by faulting than at a faster ridge. So this model it's a little complex to work out, but generally speaking, the eruption rate is going to depend on the change in pressure with the change in depth. And for most of these systems, the buoyancy of the magma relative to the rock is going to be similar. So the only thing that controls it is how much overpressure there is. The overpressure in a magma body basically has to get larger than the kind of background stress for a dike to emerge or propagate. So if in this plot, which is depth versus stress, you see the lithostat coming down here for a slow spreading ridge. There's a transition in the slope of this line where you go from igneous crust down to more mantle rocks, or from upper crust to lower crust. But the magmatic pressure that you're going to need is not going to change the eruption rate very much if you just have lithostatic stress. So the idea is that you're decreasing that lithostatic stress by imposing some stretching on the system. And if that stretching is different between fast and slow spreading ridges, you could explain this variation by differences in tectonic stress. The model that I think passes the eye test or makes the most sense is that the eruption rate depends on magma pressure, or the magma chamber depressurization. So you have a balloon of magma, you make a dike come off of that, and you've essentially then started to release the pressure in it, and the pressure driving the eruption decreases. So this is kind of the cartoon of what happens. You have a filled magma chamber, you have an eruption, it decreases in size and causes the surface to deflate. This is a model and actual observations from Krafla, the 1978 eruption, where you have distance from the caldera, so the propagation rate and time, and you can see that the propagation rate slows down as you move further in time. So the more magma you withdraw from the system, the less pressure you have to drive the eruption. At fast spreading ridges, the magma chambers are lower in the crust, or they're shallower in the crust, so the dikes don't have to go quite as far to erupt than at slow spreading ridges. So just to a first order, the amount of magma that you're removing from a magma chamber at a fast spreading ridge is going to be smaller than at a slow spreading ridge. So this is another model that might explain this global variation. All right, so let's look at a specific eruption and see what we can see in terms of the flow morphology. I'll focus on the eruption of 2005-2006 from the East Pacific Rise, 9 to 10 north. This is depending on who you ask, either the best studied mid-ocean ridge segment or the most overstudied mid-ocean ridge segment, depending on your perspective. But I was fortunate that, I think, one of the benefits of having lots of work done here is that when an eruption occurred in 2005, we kind of knew what the background looked like, so we could do some interesting work. But it erupted in 1991, 92, and then again in 2005, 2006. It's the first time we've had a repeat eruption at the same site on a ridge, and it kind of confirmed a decadal recurrence interval that was predicted for this ridge system. So, working with Dan Fernari, we did some digital photography surveys of this area using his TOCAM system. And you can see that it was very straightforward to say where the new eruption had come out on the seafloor relative to the old eruption. So we're looking at, year-old lava versus 12-year-old lava, and the difference is very stark. So we saturated this area. These are the tracks of the camera toes, and based on those, identified the contacts between old and new lava and came up with a general map for the eruption. Subsequently, we did a survey with the DSL 120 kilohertz sonar system that Paul was out there with at the time, and from that we were able to refine the map of the eruption. And at the time, this was, I would say, the most comprehensively mapped seafloor eruption that we know about. So that's since changed, but at the time, this was kind of the best known eruption that there was. So those camera toes collected over 100,000 images, and I had a student look at every single one of them and classify them based on the morphology of the lava that she saw. And so she looked for pillows, lobates, and sheets, and this is kind of the results of that work. And then in kind of bins of latitude, she looked at the relative proportions of these morphology types. And what comes out of this is that towards the center of the eruption, we have mostly sheet flows, and towards the end of the eruption, we have more pillows. In this case, we took the lobates, which are kind of in between, and divided them equally between pillows and sheets. And so when you look at, that's this eruption right here, the average pillows to sheets is shown by the square, and this dot shows the ends of the eruption, and this dot shows the center of the eruption. So I think this fits pretty well with the idea that the farther a dike propagates, the lower the eruption rate is going to be. So there's very little change in the chemistry along this eruption that could result in a viscosity difference, and certainly tectonic stress is not likely to be very different along this 18-kilometer stretch. All right, so there's another observation about which model might be appropriate for explaining eruption dynamics variations, but it's all rather unsatisfying because we don't have any quantitative constraints on eruption rates. Direct observations, as I mentioned, are near impossible to get, but there is one. This is the 98 eruption of Axial volcano, and this device here was called the rumbleometer, I think. And we had a pressure sensor in it, and the lava flow came along and froze around the legs of this device, and then the lava flow inflated and deflated. So you can see this thing being lifted up and dropped back down. It's a single point, so it's not necessarily the best observation for determining the eruption rate, but timescales of minutes to hours is how the timescales of this eruption was changing. So I'm going to describe in the next part of the talk kind of geospeedometry method that I've come up with to try and quantify eruption rates. And it's based on the degassing of mid-ocean ridge basalts. So the kind of points we need to just cover quickly are that mid-ocean ridge basalts, magmas, contain dissolved water and CO2. And the concentration, or the relative concentrations of those two volatile species, depends on the pressure. So in this plot of CO2 versus water, you can see these contours of pressure, and this comes from experimental work done by Jackie Dixon and Ed Stolper and others. So a compilation of mid-ocean ridge basalts would show up something like this. The water is, for the most part, relatively low. The CO2 can range from very low up to 400 parts per million. And based on the experimental work, would reflect a large variation in the pressure that this lava equilibrated at. So if we plot this a different way, so here we're looking at that saturation pressure from the last plot versus the pressure that the lava was erupted at. You can see that many samples fall along this line, which means they're in equilibrium with the depth they erupted at, but a large number of them fall well above this line. That means they have more CO2 dissolved in them than they should relative to their pressure. The reason that they do is that the process of releasing that excess gas by making bubbles can happen more slowly than the process of releasing the pressure on them. So they can get out of equilibrium because you can't make bubbles fast enough or grow bubbles fast enough to accept this volatile element that wants to come out of the mill. But what I was interested in is whether you could use that supersaturation in CO2 as kind of a chronometer. So in red here are samples from this eruption of the East Pacific Rise. You can see they range from very supersaturated down to not too supersaturated. Once they erupt, they're held at relatively constant pressure and constant temperature. And so if we can learn something about how the degassing takes place, we can potentially put a clock on the eruption. So this is kind of a side note, but we're all interested in global carbon budgets, and there's been a debate about the contribution from mid-ocean ridges to the global carbon budget. And there's two ways that people go about trying to estimate how much carbon comes out of ridges. And this is carbon from the mantle, so this is magmatic carbon. One way is to measure the helium-3 that comes out of hydrothermal systems. So this is a primordial element and should have a kind of secular equilibrium with carbon. So you can use the helium-3 concentration to say something about how much carbon comes out. The other is to estimate the amount of carbon in the mantle, melt that mantle a little bit, and then release that all out the top of the system. The problem with doing that is that, as I just showed you, there are often times that the carbon that's been extracted from the mantle stays in the rock, doesn't come out of the system. And an example of that is Alberto Soule measured you found a way to measure the carbon in the mantle and made an estimate of how much comes out of the ridge, but he assumed that the lava completely degasses. And if it doesn't degas completely, his estimate would have to be cut in half. So there is some utility to these observations that I'm making beyond just looking at the dynamics of lava flows and extending to potentially the issues of carbon flux. All right, back to business. All right, so here's an example of the 120 kilohertz side scan sonar data that we collected, and the ridge axis runs through here. You can see the extent of the lava flow outlined in red, and these low reflectivity patches are areas of sheet flows where basically the lava has focused or channelized. So the idea was to collect samples along flow pathways through the system and look at how the degassing evolves as the lava spends more and more time at the seafloor. I should note that, prior to this mapping effort, we didn't have the capability to do this kind of sampling in a seafloor eruption. We couldn't confidently say that this suite of samples that we collected moving away from the ridge axis was from an individual event. So this question that I was asking really could only be done once we had sufficient mapping to identify a lava flow. So this is just the interpretation of that mapping. In orange and yellow are the kind of lava channels, so these are the pathways that the lava took. The gray is kind of the background or more diffuse flow of the lava. So we subjected these samples to a variety of different analytical techniques, electron microprobe, ICP-MS. I'll talk mostly about the volatile element measurements that I did at Hui using a secondary ion mass spectrometer, and some results from measuring helium by crushing and melting the rocks, and a bit about the kind of microscopy, looking at the vesicles and the crystals in these rocks. So what I'm showing here is the volatile concentrations, and for the rest of the talk I'll show these measurements or results in terms of distance along the flow. So thinking back to that map from a few minutes ago, 0 is at the ridge axis, and the flow extended nearly 2.5 kilometers. Samples are dots that are shown in blue are from the east side of the axis, and red from the west side of the axis. So there's 5 volatile elements that I'm showing here: fluorine, sulfur, chlorine, CO2, and water. You can see that fluorine and sulfur are fairly constant along the whole length of the flow. Chlorine and water show slight increases as you move down the flow, and CO2 shows a significant decrease. So first I'll take the chlorine and water. These clearly don't reflect degassing because there's an enrichment in chlorine and water as the lava spent more time at the seafloor. But you can explain this enrichment by having the lava interact with seawater or incorporate seawater as it's moving across the seafloor. And I and others have found these unusual features in submarine lava flows. So here we're looking at kind of a lobate lava flow where the crust is broken away and you're seeing into the center of the flow. It's hollow inside there, and hanging down from the upper surface are these drips of lava. So there is, when you're emplacing these flows, there's some void space underneath that upper crust and potential for seawater to get into the system. So if you look at the chlorine and water versus kind of equally incompatible elements that shouldn't change within the flow, you see that this enrichment is real, and you can model this quite easily as increasing incorporation of seawater. So that's kind of an aside to the main story that I'm going to tell you about, which has to do more with the CO2 in the water. So going back to that pressure relationship, we can look at how the CO2 and water reflect a decreasing saturation pressure as you move along the flow. Near the eruptive vent, the pressure of equilibration is equivalent to a pressure at the depth of the melt lines. So it looks like the magma came up from depth without losing any of its gas. And then as it flowed across the seafloor, that saturation pressure decreases, never quite reaches the equilibrium with the seafloor pressure, but it decreases, seemingly reflecting a process of gas loss as the lava moved across the seafloor. So what controls that solubility of the volatile elements? Well, pressure, temperature, and composition are all constant throughout this lava flow. And I don't necessarily, I'm not going to show you the data to support that, but you can trust me that the pressure stays the same because you're at the seafloor, you're not really changing depth. The temperature stays the same within a couple degrees, and the composition stays the same. So the thing that's changing is the time that the lava's been sitting at the seafloor, or the dynamics. So to help understand what's happening, we looked at the vesicularity within the lava. And for comparison, I have two samples shown here. One is the popping rock, which is a kind of a famous vesicular mid-ocean ridge basalt from the Mid-Atlantic Ridge with 16 volume percent vesicles. And by comparison, this is one of the samples from this study. This is 5 millimeters. This is a half a millimeter. You can see the bubbles are much smaller and much fewer in this rock. There's in a recent compilation by Deborah Shafrit, there's this general relationship that as you go deeper, as the eruptions occur deeper, you have fewer vesicles. This is a reflection of the hydrostatic pressure on the system, but this rock was erupted deeper than this rock, and there's really no significant control from the depth. It's more from the initial volatile concentration and the dynamics of the system. So in these rocks, again looking at flow distance, we have a general increase in the vesicle concentration. So this is usually measured in terms of volume percent. That seems to correspond or correlate negatively with the amount of gas that's dissolved in the lava. You can see we go from high gas concentrations and few bubbles to low gas concentrations and relatively more bubbles. Still, it's a pretty small change from 0.1 to 1 volume percent. So in order to know whether we can use these bubbles as to tell us something about how the degassing has occurred, we looked at the helium concentration in these rocks. And so we looked at the helium concentration in the vesicles, so that's by crushing the rock up under vacuum, and in the glass by heating that same rock up under vacuum. And what we see is that the total helium is relatively constant. It's just the amount that's partitioned into the vesicles versus staying in the glass. So what this tells you is that there's not that the vesicles are conserved in this system. You're not losing vesicles out of the system or adding more bubbles into the system. It's what we call closed system degassing. Another way we can look at the vesicles is look at their populations, or try to get characteristics of their populations in each sample. And the model for this is vesicle size distribution. It's kind of the idea is that there's a conservative system where bubbles are growing and nucleating, and that by looking at the variation in that population as a function of size, you can learn something about both how many bubbles are there and how they're growing. So in a plot of the natural log of n, where n is the number of bubble nuclei per unit volume, the vesicle diameter, and the nucleation growth and time scale, the intercept of that line is the number of nuclei, and the slope of this line is equal to 1 over the growth rate of the bubbles and the time scale of bubble growth. So that's the important thing here, is that the slope of that line reflecting the population of bubbles reflects how quickly the bubbles are growing and how long they've been growing. So processes that change this line, or the slope of this line, include nucleation. So if you add a bunch of small bubbles, you're going to make this line steeper. Diffusion, where you're just growing the bubbles that are already there, that's going to shallow out this line. and coalescence, where you're going to kind of screw with the population at the higher size fractions. So when we look at this collectively for the whole sample suite, a couple of important things come out. One is that the number of bubbles, so the number of bubbles per unit volume, doesn't show any systematic change with time, but the growth rate times the time scale increases. So what this suggests is that the bubbles are getting bigger by diffusion, and we're not adding a whole lot of new bubbles. So we can model this degassing process as one of controlled by diffusion. So there's lots of different models out there that you could apply to this. The one that I chose is one of the simpler models that goes all the way back to the 1950s, and basically we can use this because the system is so simple. We're at a constant pressure, constant temperature, bubbles growing by diffusion. So this is the model. It depends on the diffusion rate of CO2 in basaltic magma, which has been empirically measured. The concentration difference between the supersaturated system and the equilibrium system, and the initial size of the bubbles, which we can measure from that vesicle size distribution. So depending on that concentration difference, you can have bubbles that grow more quickly or more slowly. What I did was integrate this model to reflect the change in supersaturation at each time step. So basically, take a population of bubbles, and at each time step allow them to grow by diffusion, change that supersaturation or chemical driving force, and allow the system to evolve. And what we see is that in order to go from the supersaturated condition that we have of over 300 parts per million CO2 down to the least saturated, supersaturated condition we have would require about 2.5 hours. So that's pretty cool. So based on the bubbles that we see and the gas loss that we see, we can put a time scale on this eruption or the duration of this eruption for 2.5 hours. So this is measured from one part of the whole eruption. We know from some radionuclide dating that was done by Ken Rubin that this eruption occurred over a 6-month period of samples from along the whole eruptive fissure, and they span a period of 6 months. So what that means is that the 6-month period was punctuated by short pulses of eruption that last a very short time. The modeling suggests that in order to completely degas this lava, we would need the eruption to last roughly 10 hours. So that's a useful constraint for when we look at other systems and see that they're completely degassed. So another thing we can do with these results is we can take each sample. We know the time period over which it was degassing based on how much CO2 is in there. We know how far it is from the eruptive vent, so we can assign a flow velocity to it. And when we do that, we see that flow velocities range from 0.6 to 0.2 meters per second. These samples here that are these points that are not filled are samples that did not degas enough to provide a useful constraint. The nice thing is that this range in flow velocities is similar to what you'd expect from kind of simple fluid dynamics. And the important thing is that the samples the samples that are nearest the vent, which we assume are the earliest eruptive material, seem to have a higher flow rate than those at the distal end of the eruption. And this is kind of what we expect based on our observations from subaerial systems. Eruptions start off with very high flow rates and then decrease with time. This is again reflecting kind of decompression of that magmatic source region. So the fact that we see this gives me some additional confidence that this is actually a useful constraint on the dynamics. So in the sample suite that we looked at, there's very little degassing that takes place over this first stretch or kilometer or so of the eruption. Based on that, we can say, and that reflects about 0.75 hours of eruption time. So based on that, we can say that the lava or the magma moved from seafloor depth up to, or from magma chamber depth up to seafloor depth in some time period that's shorter than that. That would suggest an ascent rate for this dike of 0.45 meters per second, and that fits in well with observations from earthquake propagation rates. So this is some work by Bob Ziak and others, where they looked at earthquake propagation rates for a number of seafloor and non-seafloor eruptions, and noted that at propagation rates higher than 0.3, we had eruptions or megaplumes or temperature changes. So in this case, we're in that field where we expect an eruption to occur. Oops. All right, so that was a nice study and the first example of SIN emplacement, degassing of an eruption and how it can tell us about timescales. But perhaps that was just a fortuitous example, and would we be able to use this method other places? So I'll show you a little bit of the work that's kind of ongoing right now related to the 2011 eruption of axial volcano. The reason I'm trying to apply the same method at this site is because, again, we have a very detailed map of where the eruption deposits were, and that allows us to find or collect samples that reflect increasing distances from the erupting event or increasing time. The other reason is that there's a large cabled observatory going in here, and there's ships there all the time. So these samples that are shown by these black dots are collected over, 4 or 5 different cruises where kind of samples of opportunity. So in addition to the eruption that occurred at the summit of axial volcano, there was potentially another eruption here about 30 kilometers away, and there's a number of samples that were collected from that as well. So this is the map that Dave Caress put together. So this is a bathymetric difference map from prior to the eruption and after the eruption with the depth differences shown here, or the scale for the depth differences shown here. Another reason to apply this method to this eruption is that there's some independent measures of the dynamics. So for example, this plot up here shows the temperature record at an instrument that was cited right here relative to the deflation signal of the summit. So the blue line is the deflation signal. Where it starts to go down is where they think the dike reached the surface and the eruption started. And where this temperature goes up, theoretically could be the point when the lava came closest to this. So based on that, there would be a velocity of about 0.07 meters per second, a bit slower than what we saw in the In addition, there's some constraints on the ascent rate. So there's an earthquake swarm onset before the eruption that based on that time difference between when the caldera started to deflate and when that earthquake swarm started, if that reflects dike propagation, that would reflect propagation rate of 0.16 to 0.2 meters per second, so slightly below, again, the East Pacific rise eruption. Here are similar plots to what I showed you before. EPR, again, is red. The axial samples show a similar set of features. Some are very supersaturated, and they come close to equilibrium with the seafloor. The distribution of those relative supersaturations is shown here.
So here's saturation pressure as a function of distance, and the colors indicate 4 sets of samples that seemingly reflect increasing flow distances. And again, or I should say, the data is not perfect. You see some samples that don't seem to follow any sort of trend. I would just note that many of these samples are difficult to assign to a flow path. They may reflect certainly complex flow within this eruption, but the majority of them seem to show a general decrease in saturation pressure with distance. The EPR eruptions seem to stay relatively or highly supersaturated and then drop off in terms of supersaturation, whereas the axial samples seem to decline in supersaturation more quickly. That would suggest decreased flow rates similar to the independent measures of dynamics that I showed you before. We can also look at the degree of supersaturation along the eruptive fissure. And when we do that, we see that the region right in here shows the highest supersaturations. One could imagine then that the dike initiated in this region and propagated to the north and the south. Those samples from that distal fissure are very close to equilibrium with the seafloor pressures. And then we have ongoing work looking at the vesicularity and crystallinity of these rocks. The vesicularity is in some cases much higher than what we saw at the East Pacific Rise, but shown relative to the carbon dioxide and relative to what a closed system degassing path is. We seem to have a similar closed system degassing in this eruption. And in terms of the vesicle size distributions, this growth rate versus time versus saturation pressure, we see higher growth rate versus time in the least saturated samples. And if you assume a constant growth rate, we would say that these reflect a longer period of degassing than these. So things seem to be on the same track, but one of the issues with this method is that the models are not very well constrained. So to address that, I have some experiments underway with Jim Gardner at UT Austin.
The real Jim Gardner.
The other Jim Gardner. And so what we're doing is taking these samples, heating them up and decompressing them, and under those controlled circumstances, looking at how the degassing occurs and how the bubbles grow. All right, so that's where I'm going to stop for now. The last thing to summarize this, one of the things I wanted to show you was this plot of equilibration depth. So this is the depth reflected by the CO2 and water content as a function of spreading rate. And shown on top of this is the approximate brittle ductile transition and the location or the depth of various axial magma chambers as a function of spreading rate. And you can see that the volatiles recorded, or the pressures recorded by the volatiles in these glasses fits very nicely with our models for what the crustal structure looks like as a function of spreading rate. And that is until you get to very slow spreading rates. So the idea, the message from this figure is that there is eruption dynamics are changing with spreading rate. This is just an independent measure of that at fast spreading rates, eruption rates are high and you lock in this supersaturation, and at very slow spreading rates, the dynamics are slow, or ascent rates are slow, and you lose all your gas and don't record that. Yeah, so I'll stop there and take any questions. Thank you.
Do you have any reason to think that the mid-plate volcanism would be different than what you're seeing in the spreading?
Do you mean like Hawaii, for example?
Well, or Hawaii,
seamounts?
or just, you see volcanic features all over the seafloor, and so
Yeah.
The magma chamber dynamics is really different than it is in the ridgecrest.
Yeah, exactly. I would expect things to be closer to slow spreading ridge systems. I mean, one place, you can see that the Gackle Ridge is on here, and that's almost like a intraplate seamount because magmatism gets very focused in those areas. So, yeah, I think that, it's a good question. I mean, I know.
One of the things I see in the modeling data in these features are, we call them calpies, but these things that Clegg is published on, kind of low, flat features that are 5,000 meters of water. And so you don't see those kinds of features at all around ridgecrest.
No.
Why?
No cows on
Is it just the pressure of the water depth?
No, I don't think so. I think it's an eruption rate
Okay.
issue. So what I would expect is that if you went to those and measured the volatiles, you would see that they're completely degassed because
Okay.
they're occurring more slowly.
Yeah.
That's what I think, but it's fairly easy to test with data. It's a million samples from those.
So you're saying, rule of thumb is that ridgecrest volcanism is much faster than mid-plate volcanism?
No.
And why would you say that?
No, I'm not saying that specifically. I'm saying these cowpie features probably reflect lower eruption rates, but I can't really say what I don't know enough about detailed studies of mid-plate volcanoes. I mean, the first step would be to look at the flow morphology and get a sense from that. But I don't have any preconceived notion that it should be lower eruption rates. If the magma supply is lower, it seems like that results in lower eruption rates. If the magma chamber is deeper, I would predict lower eruption rates. But you see places like West Mata and things like that where it actually does have low eruption rates, but it can also produce kind of explosive eruptions at the same time.
So I want to ask about the flow morphology, because a lot of what you talk about is, in essence, looking at the difference between the injection point and something distal.
Mm-hmm.
And when I see a photomosaic like you showed, I can clearly see where the lobe is and what the distal part would be. But if you're interpreting just the morphology, just the bathymetry, even if it's as good as we can make it, how are you sure that you're seeing the right direction for distal and?
That point A is connected to point B.
Yeah, and that point A is where it originated, and point B is the lobe. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, lobes are lobe, but.
yeah, no, I'm not sure.
Aside from that, things are very complex.
Yeah. Well,
It looks to me like you were making the assumption that the center is always the origin and it moves out.
yeah, right. So I've thought about that a lot. So the kind of next level assumption there is that the material that's you pick up closest to the axis is the first erupted material,
Right.
and the stuff at the end is the last erupted material. And that's something that I believe, because I think that the quenching of the lava is very efficient and that most of the flow happens kind of underneath the crust. And I know that there's certainly complications to that, but in this particular instance, it doesn't matter, because what really matters is how long it's been molten at seafloor pressure. So the stuff that quenches at the vent or near the vent has only flowed 5 meters or something like that. So it hasn't had very long of a time at the seafloor. The stuff that's at the distal end had to go all that distance. It does complicate it. If you don't believe that assumption, that it muddies the water a little bit. I'm a little bit buoyed by the fact that the timescales I see match with predictions that are independent. So that's all I can't prove it until we actually see one of these things happen.
Could you talk more about those features that you said it was sort of like a hollow feature and maybe even icicles coming down, sort of, or I don't know what you call that, a basaltical? And with that transfer of gases, then if you were, I would have thought that it would just be this surface and everything would be going up, but if you have sort of a hollow spot, then you could be transferring it down into the water. And then, if you were talking about the carbon flux from the lava then into the water, maybe you have two sides of the lava that is transferring it into.
Yeah, so, there's this very tiny minority of people who actually argue about this arcane thing. But so it's pretty clear that when the lava flow is moving, you've quenched that top surface, and then you have some void space in there. There's no other way to make a lava sickle. It can't, grow otherwise. So, and it's also pretty clear that there's seawater or vaporized seawater in there, whether it comes from below or above, it almost doesn't matter. I could show you a slide that where you can see some seawater being incorporated into the lava, and you can map out the chlorine distribution. You can see it kind of actually going in there. So that's why I'm pretty confident that that's a process that occurs. In terms of the carbon transfer, I actually didn't kind of get the last part of your question, but yeah, I think this is that's kind of an aside, a little something that happens, but doesn't really control anything on a large scale.
Where does the carbon come from, the CO2 come from? What's the origin, the ultimate origin of it?
Well, it comes from the mantle.
So you think it's juvenile carbon?
Yes. Yeah.
It's not recycled at all?
Oh, well, it could be recycled, but they're, typically mid-ocean ridges are pretty far from, any subduction zones. There's not generally a signal of contamination like you would see in ocean island basalts.
But the mantle is slowly
it's mixing. Yeah, it's so certainly some of it could be recycled material, but there is some juvenile carbon in the mantle.
Does it have a characteristic isotopic signature?
Magmatic carbon is isotopically doesn't differ very much, so it's all I guess slightly heavy. I'm not sure exactly what the carbon signature is, but people do look at the carbon isotopes in terms of fractionation during the degassing process. There's a small fractionation during diffusion through a melt. But I have not looked at carbon isotopes in these systems. Great. Thanks.
Thank you.